Hello, welcome to another edition of Peace is Possible, where we talk about peace issues not being talked about in the mainstream media. My name is Joe Wasserman. On November 9th, 2019, the Connecticut Peace and Solidarity Coalition held its fourth annual conference at Middlesex Community College in Middletown. The theme of the conference was Retooling the Connecticut War Economy. Medea Benjamin, a noted peace activist from a national peace and justice organization called Code Pink, was the guest speaker. This is the second of 3 video segments showing parts of this important conference. This part of the video will cover Miriam Pemberton's presentation. Miriam Pemberton has conducted research as to how moving away from a war dependency to a more diversified peace economy can create good living wage jobs. She is a research fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies and often speaks about issues related to peace conversion and demilitarization. Studies have in fact shown that peace conversion can create many more jobs than war dependency. Such studies include a paper published by Brown University called The Job Opportunity Costs of War, published by Heidi Garrett Pelletier, and one by Miriam Pemberton called Military versus Climate Security. Since this conference, the Trump administration has escalated our military presence in the Middle East. I urge you to call the offices of our 2 U.S. senators and the office of Congressman John Larson to oppose this military escalation and call for peaceful solutions. Ask that Congress stand up to and say no to needless and endless war. You can be connected by calling the Congressional Switchboard at 202-224-3121, 202-224-3121. Ask them to cut off funding for any possible war with Iran and to work for withdrawing our troops from danger in both Iraq and Syria, and to respect the wishes of the Iraqi parliament, which has asked all foreign troops, including U.S. troops, to leave Iraq. Ask them to co-sponsor the Sanders-Connor resolutions to cut off funding for any unauthorized war with Iran. Senator Blumenthal has done so already as of this taping. You can also contact myself, Joe Wasserman, if you'd like to get more involved with peace advocacy at 860-561-1897 or joewass64@yahoo.com. Thank you.
First, I'm going to quote Smedley Butler, who says, 3 steps must be taken to smash the war racket. We must take the profit out of war. Martin Luther King says, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. Dwight Eisenhower says we must guard against the acquisition of unwanted influence by the military-industrial complex. And then I put a quote in here of my own. Is there a connection between investing in a violent military economy with over $700 billion per year and the increase in the increase in all forms of violence that we see in our communities that threatens the safety of our children and grandchildren? And we're going to address this to the people of Connecticut so that you people can bring something back to where you work, where you go to church, your family, and get the conversation going. We need to do more than just have meetings. Okay, so we have 3 panelists here. And we're going to go... Miriam Pemberton works in Washington, D.C. She'll go first. Dave Iano, who has worked in lived in the city of Hartford for many years, will talk about how the federal government budget does not help the inner city of Hartford too much. And finally, Mitch here will tell about how this military-industrial complex really affects climate. Okay, so Marion will go first. Marion was a researcher and then director of the National Commission for Economic Conversion and Disarmament. Before directing the Peace Economy Transition Project at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., she is currently under contract to do a book on the U.S. war economy and will present a paper on economic conversion at a side event of the United Nations General Assembly First Committee. I think there might be papers being passed around to write some questions down. If you could do that, we're going to have Miriam speak for 10, 12 minutes, then Dave, and then Mitch. Miriam?
Thanks very much. It's great to be here. Nobody has mentioned so far the anniversary that this day is. So 30 years ago today, those people climbed up on the Berlin Wall and started swilling champagne and taking hammers. It is literally true that that day changed my life. So I thought I'd just mention why. I got a PhD in English literature, and it took me a long time. I was having babies, and when I got to the end of it, I kind of knew I didn't want to be an English professor, but I didn't know what I did want to do. I was more interested in politics, but I figured this is my destiny. I will go and be an English professor. So I started this academic job search that my heart was not in, and but I thought on the way I will take a temporary editing job with this organization called the National Commission for Economic Conversion and Disarmament. I didn't know what economic conversion was, but it sounded, vaguely progressive, and, why not? So here comes the anniversary. I took this job a month before the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so suddenly the idea of spending my time looking at the technical, political, and economic means of converting military resources to civilian use became this huge issue, and it was going to be the linchpin for everything I cared about. We were going to cut the military budget and invest in education and healthcare and in the environment. So I got completely hooked by this issue, and there went my academic career, and I've never regretted it. And I'm just happy today to be here with folks who I think actually get this kind of strange passion of mine. So I'm very happy to be celebrating this, or commemorating anyway, that milestone here with all of you. So the UN Disarmament Office asked me to write a paper about economic conversion. And so I did that, and so I presented it there a couple weeks ago, and was dismayed to hear that the UN is so financially strapped that this set of papers that they've commissioned are not going to be published on paper until next year, when they might have the money to do it. Anyway, so what I did in this paper, I think I'll just do briefly for you, which is talk right into the, oh, that's so much better. Okay, there we go. I'm just going to lay out quickly what I see as the 4 necessary conditions for economic conversion to actually happen, and then I actually added another one in if I have time. So the most important condition is the one that we're all talking about here. Conversion really only happens when military budgets are falling. When they're rising, it pretty much doesn't happen. But as is also implied by the framing of this conference, just cutting the military budget is not enough. You have to do targeted reinvestment in the parts of the economy that can actually be what economists call a demand pull, that will be somewhere for the defense industry to go. If you don't do all of that reinvestment, then you're going to have slack in the economy. You're going to threaten recession. And of course, you're going to create extreme pressure from defense-dependent firms and communities and workers to force the military budget back up again. It's kind of a chicken and egg problem. So you need to have military budgets falling to get conversion, and you also need to get military budgets to fall. You've got to convince enough people that conversion is really possible. So the second condition that I've identified is that governments need to create programs to sort of overcome the inertia of defense firms and defense-dependent communities and workers who would rather hunker down and keep doing what they're doing. So in this period after the wall fell, in the post-Cold War period, the U.S. developed some programs that did actually facilitate the transition. So these were programs of technical assistance for medium and small defense-dependent businesses to teach them to retool and to restructure their operations for the different demands of the commercial sector. There were some retraining programs for defense-dependent workers. Some of them actually worked. And then there were grants to underwrite the work of defense-dependent communities in planning a transition to a less militarized economic base. The flagship program was called the Technology Reinvestment Project, and they gave grants to consortia of commercial manufacturers and defense manufacturers and other entities, nonprofits, labor, the national labs, economic development folks, to commercialize defense technologies. One of my favorite successes from this period was Lockheed Martin, the defense behemoth of them all, figured out with these other entities how to take the hydraulic system from one of their military jets and use it to become the drivetrain for hybrid electric buses. And there are now 8,000 of those buses, and they're on the streets of New York and Chicago, Tokyo, London, and so on. So there isn't any comprehensive accounting of conversion success rates, but a few U.S. studies done in the early years of the post-Cold War period found that successful conversion was surprisingly common among small to medium-sized defense contractors, and they often credited some of these government programs I've been talking about. There were some successes among the large prime contractors. One study found that firms with robust diversification strategies were enjoying higher profits, greater productivity growth, healthier rates of R&D investment than contractors more entrenched in defense markets. There were the national labs that are focused mostly on nuclear weapons research. The government and civil society groups came up with some fairly detailed plans for how to convert those labs into doing things like work on environmental protection. But as we all know, toward the end of the century, what came down in terms of the defense budget began to go up. So just a few reasons for that. There was, in fact, insufficient investment on the civilian side of the budget, to be the demand pull to draw the defense sector into civilian production. There was, of course, the determined resistance of the defense industry to do anything like conversion for the most part. And of course, we've all heard about the ways that they manipulate defense budgets, which is, campaign contributions to, specific key committee chairs who control the money, and then spreading defense contracts as far and wide as they possibly can to create what I call a political protection racket for themselves. And then they began to redefine conversion. And their favorite definition for conversion was really, arms exports or conversion. So we're going, if we can't sell them here, we're going to sell them all around the world, and we will convert ourselves to that. And then, of course, 9/11, enough said. So the third condition that I identified in this paper was the multiplicity of approaches that civil society needs to take to support conversion. So research and education, what we're doing right now. Advocacy on behalf of a fiscal shift. I'll make a plug for an organization that's now part of my organization. It's called the National Priorities Project. Maybe I don't even need to talk about them, but they really do look at, they produce a lot of illustrations of the trade-offs between military production and education and healthcare and sorry, thank you. And so on. They break down the military budget in terms of congressional districts, what are you getting and what are you giving up. Then internationally, there's this Global Day of Action on Military Spending that's timed for the release of global military data from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the SIPRI. And I wonder if you all participate in this Global Day of Action. The idea is to do teach-ins and various kinds of actions, and then post photos and documents on their website. If you don't participate yet in that effort, seems like definitely worth doing. It's in April. It changes every year, and now they've sort of expanded it as like a week-long thing, even a month-long thing. But it's April. That's when this data comes out. Then there's various efforts that I think some of you have been involved in with sort of specific targets to illustrate the broader issue. So focusing on individual contractors, individual communities, or specific weapon systems. There's advocacy for base conversion, closing bases, and redeveloping them for the community's own purposes. In some ways, that's easier to do because bases are actually public assets, and there's a pretty good process that they've set up to involve all stakeholders in figuring out what to do with a base that's been closed. Of course, the kicker is there hasn't been a base closure process since the year 2005 because Congress, with their kind of bird in hand mentality, prevents any closures from taking place. And then the one that I think is most important and will be addressed by other panelists, and Medea certainly talked about it, and there are various folks who are working on connecting our issue to other salient issues, the most important of which is obviously climate change. So I think I won't belabor that point. The fourth condition that I identified was really the need for an actual industrial policy. So conversion, there's all sorts of conversions that have been successful, all over, but they're very scattered because we don't have an industrial policy that really focuses the engineering talent and the resources and the combination of regulations and taxes and all of the ways that you can actually move an economy in a new direction. Back in the post-Cold War period, we said that we need a new national mission to take the place of winning the Cold War, and that really needs to be focusing on greenhouse gas emissions, which it was already clear were going to be, causing problems that no military on the planet, will be able to solve. That's the kind of big restructuring of the economy that really is necessary to do successful conversion. And I think, most of us feel that we have a pretty good vehicle for that in the Green New Deal, but as has been mentioned, economic conversion for demilitarization is not part of that deal, but it is about large economic restructuring, and so our issue really needs to be incorporated into that deal. I'll add one more condition, which we've also touched on, which is involving key constituencies. So obviously, veterans are one of those key constituencies, and Medea also talked about the other. This will not happen without dialogue and involvement with defense-dependent workers. A few people have mentioned William Wimpesinger. Way back in World War II, the great labor leader Walter Reuther came up with a detailed plan for how the military producing factories could be converted to building modern railroad stock and low-income housing for returning GIs. I could go on, but I guess I probably shouldn't, on all of the kind of creative labor environment, anti-militarist, efforts that are underway. They will be absolutely critical to having any success. So just a few thoughts on the challenge here in Connecticut. I think I probably, for this group, don't need to run through all the ways that Connecticut is in the belly of the beast. I think the major manufacturers that are here have been mentioned. But when UTC and Raytheon merge, if they do, 3 of the 4 of the top 5 U.S. contractors have major presences in Connecticut. Connecticut is the 4th most defense-dependent state in the country in terms of total contract dollars, but it's actually 3rd in terms of the proportion of state GDP that goes to the military production in the state. So by comparison, California gets more military dollars than any other state, but because it's more diversified, it's less defense dependent. So every California resident gets $1,200, doesn't get, but the state gets $1,200 per resident from the Pentagon. Connecticut gets $4,100 per resident. So this is what we're up against. Back to key constituencies. Connecticut has one of the best labor leaders that I've ever worked with. I understand he just retired. His name is John Harrity. He was the head of the Machinists Union in Connecticut. And Medea talked about, all the obstacles to having support from defense workers who are more highly paid, and we heard all about that. But he said, my members would rather be making wind turbines than nuclear submarines. But this is their job. This is where they are. He was so Henry Lohendorf and John Harrity were part of this commission a few years ago, the Commission on Connecticut's Future, and it was John was involved in just all manner of, the manufacturing innovation funds, various environmental task forces. He was involved in all of these. And so Henry and I were talking about, needing, now that he's retired, sitting down with him, talking to him about how to sort of plug in again into all of these various Connecticut agencies that could have a hand in actual economic in Connecticut, if we could get to them. So I think we're going to try to, sit down with his successor and see how we can move forward with this. We got to rack up. I'm sorry. One more minute. Good. So I mentioned this Commission on Connecticut's Future. I was looking back. It didn't do very much. It got hijacked, as many of these processes across the country have, by defense interests and by people in the Connecticut government who just know that the defense industry is where their bread is buttered and are not gonna do anything to sort of mess that up. There were a few things that came out of this process in the recommendations, at least. Fuel cells was John's big interest. I don't know what happened with that, but focusing on this really terrific alternative to defense production that much of the defense infrastructure, and John knew it intimately, much of that infrastructure could be converted for. The recommendations added reducing to the scope of this manufacturing innovation fund. So they added it, but then they didn't really use the fund for that purpose. We wanted one staff person in the entire Connecticut government to be focused on diversification, and they said no. There were some specific tax incentives for green technology, and I don't know if those still exist. I'd love, maybe somebody here knows and could talk about that. I really do need to stop, and so I will, but I look forward to your questions and the discussion. Thanks.